In the heart of the land of Canaan, where the sky seemed to touch the earth and the promises of God echoed through the valleys, there lived a family whose destiny would forever change the history of a people. This is the story of Joseph, a young man whose journey was marked by dreams, betrayal, suffering, and an unshakable faith. The son of Jacob, grandson of Isaac and great-grandson of Abraham, Joseph was born into a family chosen by God, carrying in his veins the blood of divine promise. His journey reveals how God works even in the darkest of times, turning the worst situations into opportunities for his greater plan. Let's dive into the incredible story of this man who began as a beloved son, was sold as a slave, and ultimately rose to become one of the most powerful rulers of the ancient world. This is the story of Joseph, an ordinary man in the hands of an extraordinary God. Joseph came into the world as Jacob's 11th son, born of his deep love for Rachel, the woman for whom he had worked 14 long years. In Genesis 30:22-24, we witness the special moment of his birth. Then God remembered Rachel. He listened to her and enabled her to conceive. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son and said, "God has taken away my disgrace." She named him Joseph and said, "May the Lord add to me another son." Joseph was not just another child in Jacob's large family. He held a special place in his father's heart. Genesis 37:3 tells us, "Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate robe for him." This robe was no ordinary garment. It was a visible symbol of the unique love Jacob had for Joseph. The special bond between father and son had deep roots. Joseph was the firstborn of Rachel, the wife Jacob truly loved. For years, Rachel had remained barren while her sister Leah bore children for Jacob. So when Joseph was finally born, he became a living answer to many prayers, a fruit of true love. To Joseph, his father was a model of faith and character. To Jacob, Joseph was a ray of light in his old age. The robe Jacob gave Joseph was unlike any other. It was a long, colorful garment fit for a prince, marking him as someone set apart, exempt from the hard labor of the fields that his brothers endured. Every time Joseph wore it, it was a reminder to everyone of his favored status. The robe would soon become a powerful symbol in his story, first of love, then of deep pain. But what Jacob intended as a gesture of love, his other sons perceived as a sign of injustice. Jacob's favoritism created a growing tension in the family. Genesis 37:4 reveals the reaction of Joseph's brothers. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Jealousy began to grow like a weed in their hearts, choking out whatever affection they may have once had for him. Each loving act from Jacob toward Joseph only deepened the resentment of the other brothers. They no longer saw Joseph as a brother, but as a threat, a boy who had stolen their father's affection. The colorful robe became to them a constant reminder of the injustice they believed they were suffering. While they worked tirelessly in the fields, Joseph walked freely, robed in favor, the son who didn't have to bear the same burdens. Family tensions reached a new height when Joseph, just 17 years old, began to have strange and vivid dreams that seemed to point to a future in which he would hold authority over his family. Without fully understanding their meaning or the consequences of sharing them, Joseph told his brothers. The first dream came as a clear night vision. In Genesis 37:5-7, Joseph recounts, "Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, 'Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it.'" This dream wasn't simply the imagination of a boy. It was a divine message, a prophecy about the future that God had in store for Joseph. The sheaves symbolized Jacob's family, and Joseph's sheaf rising represented the authority he would one day hold over them. The reaction was swift and bitter. Genesis 37:8 records their reply. His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Not long after, Joseph had a second dream, even more striking. In Genesis 37:9 we read, "Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. 'Listen,' he said, 'I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me.'" This dream took things even further. Not only would his 11 brothers, the stars, bow down, but so would his father and mother, the sun and moon. A bold prophecy for any young man to share, especially one already under the weight of his brothers' envy. When Joseph told this dream to his father and brothers, even Jacob was unsettled by the implication. Genesis 37:10-11 tells us, "When he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, 'What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?'" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Jacob's rebuke wasn't only about the content of the dream, it was also about Joseph's lack of discretion. It was as if Jacob was saying, "Do you really believe that I, the head of this family, will bow to you, my son?" Still, though he corrected Joseph in public, Jacob pondered the meaning in his heart. He knew that God often spoke through dreams, and perhaps something deeper was unfolding. For Joseph's brothers, though, these dreams were the final straw. Their father's favoritism was already hard enough to bear, but the thought that one day they might bow to Joseph, that was unbearable. Jealousy turned into a burning hatred, just waiting for the right moment to erupt. Sometime later, Joseph's brothers went to Shechem, about 80 kilometers, roughly 50 miles from Hebron, where they were tending their father's flocks. While they were away, Jacob decided to send Joseph to check on them. In Genesis 37:13-14, we see the moment Jacob sends Joseph on this mission. Israel said to Joseph, "As you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I am going to send you to them." "Very well," he replied. So he said to him, "Go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring word back to me." Then he sent him off from the valley of Hebron. Joseph didn't question his father's command. Even knowing his brothers hated him, he obeyed without hesitation. Obedience was a defining trait in Joseph's life, something that would stay with him throughout his journey. He left Hebron wearing his multicolored tunic, unaware that this would be the last time he'd see his father for many years. When Joseph arrived in Shechem, he looked for his brothers, but didn't find them in the fields where he had expected them to be. As he wandered through the area searching for any trace of them, a seemingly chance encounter would alter the course of his life. Genesis 37:15-17 tells us, "A man found him wandering around in the fields and asked him, 'What are you looking for?' He replied, 'I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they are grazing their flocks?' 'They have moved on from here,' the man answered. 'I heard them say, let's go to Dothan.'" This encounter wasn't random. God was guiding Joseph's steps, even in that seemingly minor moment. The man didn't just see Joseph wandering, he asked the right question and just happened to know exactly where his brothers had gone. It was divine intervention, disguised as coincidence. With this new information, Joseph set out for Dothan, determined to fulfill the mission his father had given him. We don't know what thoughts passed through Joseph's mind on this additional journey. Perhaps he was eager to see his brothers, or perhaps he had a sense of unease about what lay ahead. Either way, he pressed on, faithful to the task his father had entrusted to him. As Joseph neared Dothan, he spotted his brothers from a distance. What he didn't know was they had already seen him. Genesis 37:18 reveals, "But they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him." That solitary figure walking toward them, wearing his unmistakable, colorful tunic, was immediately recognized, and that moment of recognition reignited all the bitterness that had built up in their hearts. As Joseph approached, probably waving or calling out to them unaware of the danger, the brothers were already conspiring against him. The distance between them was more than just physical. It symbolized the emotional rift that favoritism and jealousy had created within the family. When they saw Joseph coming, the hatred they had long harbored finally found an outlet. Far from their father's protective gaze, they could finally act on their resentment. Genesis 37:19-20 gives us a glimpse into their dark thoughts. "Here comes that dreamer," they said to each other. "Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams." Hatred had blinded Joseph's brothers. They no longer saw him as their brother, flesh and blood, but only as that dreamer, the object of their scorn. The plan was brutal and simple: kill Joseph, dump his body in a dry cistern, and lie about it. In their minds, that would be the end of his dreams of greatness. However, not all of the brothers agreed. Reuben, the eldest, stepped in. As the firstborn, he felt a greater responsibility and knew he'd have to answer to their father. Genesis 37:21-22 records his intervention. When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. "Let's not take his life," he said. "Don't shed any blood. Throw him into this cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him." Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. Reuben's plan was more humane, but still deeply flawed. He intended to secretly return and rescue Joseph later, bringing him back home safely. But he didn't have the courage to openly oppose his brothers, choosing instead a halfway measure, one that ultimately wouldn't work out as he hoped. Unaware of the conspiracy, Joseph finally reached his brothers. The encounter was swift and violent. Genesis 37:23-24 describes the scene. "So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. The cistern was empty. There was no water in it. We can only imagine the shock and fear Joseph must have felt in that moment. Just seconds earlier, he had been on a mission, likely filled with a sense of purpose. And suddenly, he was grabbed, his robe torn from him, the very symbol of his father's love, and thrown into a dry pit. The cistern, a rock-hewn hole meant to collect rainwater, was empty at that time of year. It was deep and dark, and Joseph had no way of escaping without help. The boy who had dreamed of greatness now found himself in a pit, looking up at the faces of his own brothers, filled not with love, but with hatred. From that pit, Joseph must have cried out, pleaded for mercy. Years later, his brothers would remember this moment with deep regret. In Genesis 42:21, they would say, "Surely we are being punished because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life, but we would not listen." Joseph's cries fell on deaf ears. All but Reuben had hardened their hearts. With Joseph trapped at the bottom of the pit, his brothers sat down to eat, as if nothing had happened. It was a striking display of coldness and lack of compassion. But as they were eating, something unexpected happened, something that would forever change the course of history. Genesis 37:25 tells us, "As they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt." It was a group of merchants traveling along the ancient trade route that connected Mesopotamia to Egypt, passing through Canaan. Seeing the caravan, Judah, one of the brothers, came up with an idea that he framed as more humane, but which, in reality, served both to rid himself of Joseph and to satisfy his own greed. Genesis 37:26-27 records his words. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." His brothers agreed. Judah's proposal had two main appeals in the eyes of the brothers. It avoided the direct act of murder, somewhat easing their consciences, and it also came with financial profit. Moreover, by selling Joseph to merchants on their way to Egypt, they ensured he would be far enough away, never to return, and reveal the truth to Jacob. Without wasting any time, they put the new plan into action. Genesis 37:28 describes the moment. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. The passage mentions both Ishmaelites and Midianites, likely indicating that this was a mixed caravan of merchants, different groups, but all descendants of Abraham through sons other than Isaac. The price for which Joseph was sold, 20 shekels of silver, was the average going rate for a young slave in that time. To his brothers, Joseph was worth no more than that. The young man who once dreamed of greatness had now become a mere commodity, sold like livestock, torn from his land and his family. Reuben, who had secretly planned to rescue Joseph, wasn't present when his brothers sold him. Genesis 37:29-30 shows his reaction upon returning. When Reuben returned to the cistern and saw that Joseph was not there, he tore his clothes. He went back to his brothers and said, "The boy isn't there. Where can I turn now?" Reuben was genuinely distressed, not just for Joseph, but also because, as the eldest, he felt a sense of responsibility before their father. Meanwhile, the merchant caravan continued its journey toward Egypt, taking Joseph with them as just another item among their goods. For Joseph, it was the beginning of a journey into a foreign land, where he did not know the language, the customs, or the religion. Everything he knew and loved was left behind: his father Jacob, his homeland, his freedom. His future looked bleak and hopeless, but God had not abandoned him. In fact, through this terrible injustice, God was beginning to fulfill the prophetic dreams he had given Joseph. With Joseph on his way to Egypt, the brothers now had to deal with the second part of their plan: what to tell Jacob about the disappearance of his favorite son. They decided to fabricate an elaborate lie to deceive their father. Genesis 37:31-32 tells us how they carried out the deception. Then they got Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. They took the ornate robe back to their father and said, "We found this. Examine it to see whether it is your son's robe." The multicolored robe, once the visible symbol of Jacob's love for Joseph, now became the centerpiece of a cruel deception. The brothers chose not to outright say that Joseph was dead. Instead, they presented the evidence and let Jacob draw his own conclusion, a lie that was all the more manipulative for its subtlety. When they saw their father, they didn't have to say much. They simply handed over the blood-stained robe and pretended not to know for certain whether it was Joseph's. It was a calculated cruelty, designed to make their father believe the worst without having to utter the lie themselves. Jacob's reaction was exactly what the brothers had anticipated. Genesis 37:33 reveals his immediate response. He recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." Jacob's conclusion was precisely the one they wanted him to reach. His grief was overwhelming. Genesis 37:34-35 describes the depth of his mourning. Then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, In mourning will I go down to the grave to my son." So his father wept for him. The biblical text shows us a man completely devastated by sorrow. Tearing one's clothes and wearing sackcloth were external signs of deep mourning in that culture. But Jacob's grief went far beyond mere custom. It was a sorrow that refused consolation, a pain he declared would only end with his own death. The cruel irony is that all his children came to comfort him, including the very sons who had sold Joseph and orchestrated the entire lie. They pretended to share in their father's pain while hiding the truth. Joseph wasn't dead. He was on his way to Egypt as a slave. Jacob declared he would mourn until he joined his son in the grave, expressing his intention to live the rest of his life in grief. The loss of Joseph, his favorite son, the son of his beloved Rachel, was a wound he believed would never heal. He could not imagine that years later he would receive the astonishing news that Joseph was alive and held a position of great power in Egypt. As Jacob sank into his inconsolable sorrow, Joseph's brothers moved on with their lives, carrying the weight of their terrible secret. They had rid themselves of the brother they envied, but the cost would be steep, years of living with guilt and watching their father suffer endlessly. While Jacob wept inconsolably, believing his son was dead, Joseph was arriving in Egypt as a slave. His life had been turned upside down in just a matter of days. From favored son to foreign servant, the fall seemed irreversible. Yet even in those dire circumstances, Joseph was not alone. Genesis 39:1 tells us what happened when Joseph got to Egypt. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. Potiphar wasn't just any man. He was a high-ranking officer, captain of the guard under Pharaoh. This meant Joseph found himself in the household of someone with significant status in Egyptian society. In this new and unfamiliar world, something extraordinary began to unfold. Genesis 39:2-3 reveals, "The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did." This marks one of the most powerful moments in Joseph's story. At a time when everything seemed lost, he was far from home, sold into slavery. The text makes it a point to emphasize that the Lord was with Joseph. God had not abandoned the young man. Even in the harshest conditions, God's presence in Joseph's life wasn't just a spiritual comfort, it showed in tangible ways. Joseph thrived in everything he did, to the point where his Egyptian master, a man who worshipped other gods, noticed there was something special about this young Hebrew slave. Joseph's performance was so remarkable that he quickly earned Potiphar's trust. Genesis 39:4 tells us, "Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned." For a foreign slave, newly arrived, to be placed in charge of an entire estate was nothing short of extraordinary. Joseph's rise in Potiphar's house continued. Genesis 39:5-6 describes, "From the time he put him in charge of his household, and of all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate." Joseph's positive influence was so strong that it brought blessing upon Potiphar's entire household. Crops flourished, business prospered, and the household ran smoothly, all because of Joseph's presence, and, by extension, God's presence through him. Potiphar recognized Joseph's value and gave him full authority. The only thing he concerned himself with was the food he ate, an expression that likely referred to his personal affairs, including his wife, which becomes relevant shortly. The text adds one more detail about Joseph. Now Joseph was well-built and handsome. This seemingly minor note becomes important later in the story, as Joseph's good looks would soon draw the wrong kind of attention from Potiphar's wife. Joseph's life in Potiphar's house finally seemed to have reached a point of stability. Even as a slave, he held a position of great responsibility and trust, but his appearance and his role in the household would soon lead to a new problem. Genesis 39:7 marks the beginning of that trouble. And after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." Potiphar's wife didn't merely admire Joseph from afar. She was bold and direct in her intentions, inviting him into an adulterous relationship. Joseph was facing a very real and dangerous temptation. He was young, far from home, immersed in a culture with different moral values. And the woman tempting him was powerful, the wife of his master. Many in Joseph's place might have given in, but he displayed incredible strength of character. Genesis 39:8-9 shows Joseph's firm response, but he refused and said to his master's wife, "With me in charge, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns, he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" Joseph's words reveal a lot about his integrity. First, he acknowledges his loyalty to Potiphar, recognizing the trust that had been placed in him. But more importantly, he frames the act as a sin against God. Even in Egypt, far from his family and faith community, Joseph remained grounded in his beliefs and moral values. Potiphar's wife, however, was not easily discouraged. Genesis 39:10 tells us, "And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her." This wasn't a one-time temptation. It was persistent. Day after day, Joseph was harassed, yet he stood firm in his decision. The situation came to a head one day when Joseph found himself alone in the house with Potiphar's wife. Genesis 39:11-12 describes the confrontation. One day he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants was inside. She caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. Potiphar's wife escalated her pursuit, grabbing Joseph's cloak and trying to physically force him. Joseph's reaction was immediate and clear. He fled, leaving his cloak behind. It was a powerful demonstration that for Joseph, faithfulness to God mattered more than comfort or even safety. His escape, however, turned her desire into rage. Rejected and humiliated, she decided to retaliate. Genesis 39:13-15 recounts what happened next. When she saw that he had left his cloak in her hand and had run out of the house, she called her household servants. "Look," she said to them, "this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." Potiphar's wife completely twisted the story. She portrayed herself as the victim when, in truth, she was the aggressor. She used Joseph's cloak, which should have served as evidence of his innocence, as false proof against him. Strategically, she also appealed to ethnic prejudice by pointing out that Joseph was a Hebrew, a foreigner, and she didn't stop there. Genesis 39:16-18 continues. She kept his cloak beside her until his master came home. Then she told him this story. "That Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me. But as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." The accusation was carefully crafted to provoke Potiphar's anger. She not only accused Joseph of attempting to violate her, but also subtly blamed Potiphar himself for having brought Joseph into their home. The lie was delivered so convincingly that Potiphar believed his wife without question. Potiphar's reaction was swift and severe. Genesis 39:19-20 says, "When his master heard the story his wife told him, saying, 'This is how your slave treated me,' he burned with anger. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were. Confined. To Potiphar, the evidence seemed conclusive. Joseph's cloak was in his wife's hands, and she had told a consistent story. Even if he harbored some doubt, as a high-ranking official in Pharaoh's court, he had to act to protect his reputation and honor. Joseph, the young man who had already survived being sold into slavery and had built a new life in Potiphar's household, now faced yet another dramatic fall. From a respected and trusted administrator, he became a prisoner, convicted of a crime he didn't commit. Once again, he was a victim of human injustice. The prison Joseph was sent to was not just any jail. It was the place where the king's prisoners were confined, most likely a high-security facility reserved for political offenders or those who had crossed the royal court. For Joseph, it marked the lowest point in his life again. Yet even in this dark chapter, the biblical text offers a glimmer of hope. Genesis 39:21 tells us, "But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden." Even in prison, God's presence remained with Joseph. Just as Potiphar had once recognized something special in him, the prison warden soon did as well. Just like the colorful robe had stirred envy in his brothers, and his good looks had stirred desire in Potiphar's wife, now Joseph's character would shine even in the darkness of an Egyptian prison. God's plan for his life was still unfolding, even through injustice and suffering. Pharaoh's prison was no ordinary place. It was a grim fortress where disgraced members of the royal court were detained. There, separated from everything he knew, Joseph entered a new phase of his life, falsely accused of a crime he had not committed. The cold, damp walls of the Egyptian prison would be enough to break the spirit of any man. But something was different about Joseph. As we read in Genesis 39:21, "The Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden." Even in the depths of prison, God had not abandoned Joseph. The chief warden, responsible for all the prisoners, soon noticed there was something special about this young Hebrew. We don't know exactly how Joseph conducted himself in those early days behind bars, but it's safe to imagine he showed the same integrity and dedication he had in Potiphar's house. His attitude must have stood out. Genesis 39:22 tells us, "So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there." This was a remarkable promotion. From mere prisoner, Joseph became the right hand of the warden, overseeing all the others. The warden's trust in Joseph was so complete that, according to Genesis 39:23, the warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care, because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. This scene mirrors what had happened earlier in Potiphar's house. Joseph's integrity and administrative talent once again set him apart. It's striking how the biblical text repeatedly emphasizes one key fact: the Lord was with Joseph. It's as if the writer is reminding us, despite the terrible circumstances, Joseph was not alone. God's presence continued to follow and bless him, even in a place as unlikely as an Egyptian prison. While other prisoners likely spent their days in despair, Joseph actively served, managing the prison with excellence. He transformed punishment into opportunity. Instead of giving in to hopelessness, Joseph kept trusting God and using his gifts to the fullest, even in adversity. Some time after Joseph was put in charge of the prison, two new and prominent prisoners arrived. These weren't ordinary men. They were high-ranking officials in Pharaoh's court. Genesis 40:1-3 tells us, sometime later, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their master, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with his two officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the same prison where Joseph was confined. The text doesn't specify exactly what offense these two officials committed, only that they offended Pharaoh. In the ancient world, even a minor mistake in preparing the royal wine or bread could be seen as a serious offense, perhaps even an attempt to poison the king. Whatever their misstep, it was grave enough to enrage Pharaoh and land them in prison. Being important men, these two officials were placed under Joseph's care. Genesis 44 says, the captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and he attended them. Joseph wasn't just managing the prison. He personally looked after the needs of these special prisoners. One night, something unusual happened. Genesis 40:5-7 tells us, each of the two men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were being held in prison, had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. When Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw that they were dejected. So he asked Pharaoh's officials, who were in custody with him in his master's house, "Why do you look so sad today?" Joseph showed remarkable sensitivity by noticing that something was off with the two men. He could have easily ignored their mood and focused on his responsibilities. But instead, he paid attention to their troubled faces and asked what was wrong. It was a small gesture of kindness that revealed Joseph's caring character. The two men replied in Genesis 40:8. "We both had dreams," they answered, "but there is no one to interpret them." Then Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." Joseph's response is particularly interesting. In a land full of diviners and dream interpreters, Joseph didn't present himself as an expert. Instead, he gave all the credit to God, declaring that only God can truly interpret dreams. That was a bold statement for a Hebrew prisoner in the heart of pagan Egypt. The chief cupbearer went first. In Genesis 40:9-11, he said, "In my dream I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and put the cup in his hand. It was a dream full of symbols: the vine, the 3 branches, the grapes being pressed into Pharaoh's cup. The cupbearer might have feared the worst, but Joseph brought a hopeful interpretation. In Genesis 40:12-13, Joseph explained, "This is what it means," Joseph said to him. "The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer." Joseph's interpretation was straightforward. In just 3 days, the cupbearer would be restored to his position at Pharaoh's court. Good news. But Joseph didn't stop there. Seizing the moment, he added a personal request. In Genesis 40:14-15, we see Joseph's plea. "But when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon." This is a deeply human moment in Joseph's story. Despite all his faith and trust in God, Joseph was still a man suffering under injustice. He saw the cupbearer as a potential way out. Maybe his situation could finally change. All Joseph asked was to be remembered, and that the cupbearer speak to Pharaoh on his behalf. Seeing the favorable interpretation given to the cupbearer, the chief baker gained the courage to share his own dream. In Genesis 40:16-17, he said, "I too had a dream. On my head were 3 baskets of bread. In the top basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head." This dream also featured the number 3 and referenced his profession. But there was a dark element, the birds eating from the basket on his head. Sadly, Joseph's interpretation was not as encouraging. In Genesis 40:18-19, Joseph responded, "This is what it means," Joseph said. "The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and impale your body on a pole, and the birds will eat away your flesh." This second dream had a tragic interpretation. Within 3 days, the baker would be executed by Pharaoh. The birds that were eating from the basket symbolized the birds that would feed on his body after death. Unlike the cupbearer, he would not be restored, but would face a grim end. Joseph's courage in delivering this difficult message is also noteworthy. He could have softened the blow or made something up, but he chose to tell the truth, even when it was hard to say and even harder to hear. Just as Joseph had predicted, something significant happened in Pharaoh's court 3 days later. It was a day of celebration, an important occasion in the kingdom. Genesis 40:20 tells us, "Now the 3rd day was Pharaoh's birthday, and he gave a feast for all his officials. He lifted up the heads of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker in the presence of his officials." Pharaoh's birthday was the perfect time for important decisions. In the middle of the celebration, surrounded by his officials, Pharaoh made his ruling on the 2 imprisoned officers. It was customary for kings to grant pardons or issue judgments on such festive occasions, and this day was no exception. The story continues in Genesis 40:21-22. "He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, so that he once again put the cup into Pharaoh's hand, but he impaled the chief baker, just as Joseph had said to them in his interpretation." Joseph's interpretations came true exactly as he had said. The cupbearer returned to his former role, once again placing the cup in Pharaoh's hand. The baker, on the other hand, was executed, impaled on a pole, just as Joseph had predicted. This precise fulfillment of the dreams proved that Joseph truly had a divine gift. He wasn't just making educated guesses or reading people's emotions. God had genuinely revealed the meaning of the dreams to him. For the cupbearer, this day brought joy and restoration. He returned to the palace, resumed his duties, and likely gave thanks to the Egyptian gods for his good fortune. For the baker, the day brought the tragedy Joseph had foretold. But what about Joseph? Did the cupbearer, now restored to his position, remember to mention the young Hebrew to Pharaoh? Was the prison door about to open at last for Joseph? Unfortunately, that's not what happened. Genesis 40:23 tells us, "The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him." That verse is almost painful to read. After all the help Joseph gave the cupbearer, interpreting his dream and offering him hope during the dark days of imprisonment, the man simply forgot about him once he returned to the royal court. Perhaps, in the joy of his reinstatement, the cupbearer got caught up in the celebrations and luxuries of the palace. Or perhaps he deliberately avoided mentioning that he'd received help from a Hebrew prisoner. The biblical text doesn't say exactly how much time passed, but in Genesis 41:1, we learn that 2 full years later, Pharaoh had a dream. That means Joseph remained forgotten in prison for 2 long years after the events involving the cupbearer and the baker. 2 years of waiting, 2 years of apparent abandonment. At that time, Joseph was about 30 years old. He had spent all of his youth far from home, first as a slave, then as a prisoner. For many, Such a period of waiting and suffering would have shattered any remaining hope, but God had not finished his work in Joseph's life. In fact, the most extraordinary events were still to come. 2 full years had passed with Joseph still in prison until something unusual happened in the royal palace. Pharaoh himself, the supreme ruler of Egypt, regarded by his people as a living god, had disturbing dreams that no one could explain. Genesis 41:1-4 describes the first dream. 2 years later, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile River. Suddenly, 7 healthy and well-fed cows came up from the river and began grazing among the reeds. After them, 7 other cows came up, ugly and gaunt, and stood beside the first ones on the riverbank. And the ugly, gaunt cows ate up the 7 healthy, well-fed cows. Then Pharaoh woke up. This was no ordinary dream. The Nile was Egypt's lifeblood, and cows were symbols of prosperity and fertility. But in the dream, something unnatural occurred. The scrawny, sickly cows devoured the strong, beautiful ones, a disturbing image that suggested something was seriously wrong with the natural order. Pharaoh went back to sleep, but his rest was once again interrupted by another equally strange dream. Genesis 41:5-7 recounts, "He fell asleep again and had a second dream. 7 heads of grain, healthy and good, were growing on a single stalk. After them, 7 other heads of grain sprouted, thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 healthy full heads." Then Pharaoh woke up. It had been a dream. Again, the dream involved crucial symbols of Egyptian life, this time wheat, the foundation of their diet. And once more, there was a troubling pattern. What was withered and worthless consumed what was abundant and valuable. These dreams deeply disturbed Pharaoh. Genesis 41:8 tells us, "In the morning his mind was troubled, so he sent for all the magicians and wise men of Egypt. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but no one could interpret them for him." Egypt was renowned for its magicians, priests and dream interpreters. Pharaoh had access to the most learned and experienced men in the land. They studied ancient texts, consulted the Egyptian gods, and used all their skill to decipher royal dreams. But this time, none could provide an explanation that satisfied the pharaoh. His unease must have grown with each failed attempt. In ancient Egypt, dreams, especially when they were vivid, symbolic, and repeated, were seen as divine messages. The inability of the wisest men to interpret them hinted at something extraordinary, something beyond Egypt's conventional wisdom. While the entire palace was in turmoil, desperately searching for answers, Joseph remained forgotten in prison. But God had not forgotten him, and the moment of his deliverance was finally drawing near. Pharaoh's 2 dreams, so similar in message yet expressed through different images, served a purpose. They were not mere figments of a restless royal mind or the result of a heavy meal. They were divine messages, not meant for Egypt's magicians with all their false wisdom, but for a young Hebrew man who trusted the one true God. Joseph's time in prison was about to end, and Pharaoh's troubling dreams would be the key to his release. God had been preparing Joseph through years of hardship for this very moment, when he would be called to interpret what no wise man in Egypt could understand. With all of Egypt's sages unable to explain Pharaoh's dreams, the palace fell into an atmosphere of anxiety and tension. It was in this critical moment that the chief cupbearer finally remembered Joseph. Genesis 41:9-13 records the moment he spoke up. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, "Today I am reminded of my shortcomings. Pharaoh was once angry with his servants, and he imprisoned me and the chief baker in the house of the captain of the guard. Each of us had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. Now a young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. We told him our dreams, and he interpreted them for us, giving each man the interpretation of his dream. And things turned out exactly as he interpreted them to us. I was restored to my position, and the other man was hanged. At last, after 2 long years, the cupbearer remembered Joseph. Notice how he presented Joseph to Pharaoh, not just as any prisoner, but as someone with an extraordinary gift, someone who had accurately interpreted their dreams in the past. The Pharaoh's reaction was immediate. Genesis 41:14 tells us, "So Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeon. When he had shaved and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh." The change in Joseph's life was dramatic and sudden. One moment, he was a forgotten prisoner. The next, he was being summoned into the presence of the most powerful man in Egypt. The text's mention of Joseph shaving and changing his clothes shows that he understood the significance of the moment. In Egyptian culture, a clean appearance was highly valued, especially for someone standing before Pharaoh. Imagine the scene. Joseph, the young Hebrew who had been sold as a slave and unjustly imprisoned, now walked through the royal palace corridors, escorted by guards, toward the throne room where Pharaoh awaited him. His heart must have been racing, yet his trust remained in the God who had sustained him through all those difficult years. When he finally stood before Pharaoh, there were no formalities or elaborate introductions. The ruler was eager to have his dreams interpreted. Genesis 41:15 says, "Pharaoh said to Joseph, 'I had a dream, and no one can interpret it. But I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it.'" It was a direct statement, almost a challenge. Pharaoh wasn't asking for a favor. He was stating what he expected. After all, he was the absolute ruler of Egypt, used to being obeyed without question. Joseph's response, however, showed remarkable humility. In Genesis 41:16, he said, "I cannot do it," Joseph replied to Pharaoh, "but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires." This answer reveals Joseph's true character. Before the most powerful man in the known world, he didn't try to impress or take credit for himself. Instead, he pointed to God. It was a bold declaration in Egypt, a land of many gods where Pharaoh himself was considered divine. Joseph was stating without hesitation that the God of the Hebrews, not the Egyptian gods, not the magicians, not even Joseph himself, would provide the interpretation. It was a demonstration of faith and humility that likely surprised Pharaoh, who was used to advisors constantly trying to win his favor. Unafraid of the Egyptian throne's majesty or the gravity of the moment, Joseph stayed true to his integrity and faith. He knew that any gift or skill he had came from God, and he didn't hesitate to give credit where it was due. Pharaoh, perhaps intrigued by this unexpected response, or simply desperate for an interpretation, proceeded to share his dreams in detail. Now Joseph would have to trust that the same God who gave him interpretations in prison would help him again, this time in the Egyptian court. After listening closely to both of Pharaoh's dreams, Joseph didn't hesitate to interpret them. He spoke with clarity and confidence that could only come from God. Genesis 41:25-28 records the beginning of his interpretation. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, "The dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads of grain are 7 years. It is one and the same dream. The 7 lean, ugly cows that came up afterward are 7 years, and so are the 7 worthless heads of grain scorched by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine." Joseph explained that the 2 dreams were actually one message, repeated to emphasize its certainty and importance. The cows and the grain symbolized years, 7 of abundance, followed by 7 of severe famine. The repetition of the dream in 2 different forms was a sign of divine determination. Continuing in Genesis 41:29-31, Joseph elaborated, 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt, but 7 years of famine will follow them. Then all the abundance in Egypt will be forgotten, and the famine will ravage the land. The abundance in the land will not be remembered, because the famine that follows it will be so severe. Joseph didn't just interpret the dreams, he made the gravity of the situation clear. The coming famine would be so devastating that it would completely overshadow the years of plenty. It would be an unprecedented crisis capable of ruining the land. Then, in Genesis 41:32, Joseph added, "The reason the dream was given to Pharaoh in 2 forms is that the matter has been firmly decided by God, and God will do it soon." This final part of the interpretation was a clear warning. This wasn't a distant possibility, but a divine plan already in motion. The dream's repetition was a sign of urgency and certainty. Most interpreters might have stopped there, content with having solved the mystery. But Joseph went further. He offered practical advice. In Genesis 41:33-36, he said, "And now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man, and put him in charge of the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take 1/5 of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. They should collect all the food of these good years that are coming and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh, to be kept in the cities for food. This food should be held in reserve for the country, to be used during the 7 years of famine that will come upon Egypt, so that the country may not be ruined by the famine." Joseph didn't just predict the problem, he provided a complete solution. His plan was clear and specific: appoint a wise administrator to oversee the whole land of Egypt, establish a collection system to gather 1/5 of the harvest during the years of abundance, build storage facilities in the cities to stockpile grain, use these reserves during the famine years to prevent national disaster. It was a brilliant administrative strategy, revealing not only Joseph's spiritual insight, but also his skill in leadership and planning. His time managing Potiphar's household and the royal prison had prepared him for this moment, to present a national-scale policy. Pharaoh's and his officials' reaction was one of immediate admiration. Genesis 41:37-38 tells us, "The plan seemed good to Pharaoh and to all his officials. So Pharaoh asked them, 'Can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God?'" It's remarkable that Pharaoh himself recognized that the Spirit of God was with Joseph. For an Egyptian monarch who worshipped multiple gods and considered himself divine, to acknowledge the presence of Joseph's God was extraordinary. Something in Joseph's wisdom and character had deeply moved Pharaoh's heart. Joseph's practical advice, combined with the clarity of his interpretation, had left an undeniable impression. In a single encounter, Joseph went from being a forgotten prisoner to a respected advisor in the most powerful court of the ancient world. And all of this happened because he was willing to give God the credit for his gifts. Impressed by Joseph's wisdom, Pharaoh made a surprising decision. Rather than simply thanking him for the interpretation and sending him away, Pharaoh saw in Joseph the ideal person to carry out the very plan he had suggested. Genesis 41:39-40 records Pharaoh's words. "Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, 'Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you.'" It was an unprecedented promotion. In a matter of minutes, Joseph went from being a prisoner to the second most powerful man in all of Egypt. Only Pharaoh stood above him in the hierarchy. This decision not only showed the deep impression Joseph had made, but also revealed the urgency with which Pharaoh viewed the coming crisis. To formalize this extraordinary appointment, Pharaoh conducted a symbolic ceremony. Genesis 41:41-43 describes it. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in a chariot as his second in command, and people shouted before him, Make way! Thus he put him in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Each element of this ceremony held deep cultural significance in ancient Egypt. The signet ring symbolized royal authority. The one who bore it could authorize documents in Pharaoh's name. It was like receiving the pen that signed the laws of the land. The fine linen robes were reserved for nobles and priests. They represented purity and elevated status. Joseph, who had once worn a slave's and a prisoner's clothing, was now dressed in the finest garments Egypt had to offer. The gold chain symbolized honor and public recognition. It was a visible sign to all that Joseph had Pharaoh's favor. The royal chariot represented power and presence. Joseph now had the authority to travel anywhere in Egypt as Pharaoh's representative. Heralds crying out, Make way! Declared to everyone that Joseph was no longer a despised foreigner, but an authority to whom all must show respect. Pharaoh continued to formalize Joseph's new position. In Genesis 41:44, he declared, I am Pharaoh, but without your word, no. One will lift hand or foot in all Egypt. This was a declaration of absolute authority. Nothing could happen in Egypt without Joseph's approval. It was near unlimited power, entrusted to a former slave and prisoner. The transformation in Joseph's life could not have been more complete. To fully integrate Joseph into Egyptian society, Pharaoh did two more significant things. First, he gave Joseph an Egyptian name. Genesis 41:45 tells us, Pharaoh gave Joseph the name Zaphanath-Paneah and gave him Asenath, daughter of Potipharah, priest of On, to be his wife. The name Zaphanath-Paneah likely meant God speaks and he lives, or the revealer of secrets. It acknowledged Joseph's unique ability to interpret dreams. The new name also made it easier for Egyptians to accept Joseph in such a high-ranking position, since a foreign name might have been met with resistance. Second, Pharaoh arranged a marriage for Joseph with Asenath, the daughter of a high priest. And not just any priest, but one from On, Heliopolis, one of the most important religious centers in Egypt. This marriage tied Joseph to Egypt's religious elite and gave him even greater social standing. Joseph had arrived in Egypt as a penniless slave, sold by his own brothers. Now, through extraordinary circumstances guided by God, he was practically a pharaoh himself, with a new name, a wife from a noble family, and authority over the entire land. Joseph's story is a powerful reminder of how God can transform even the worst situations into opportunities for his greater plan. Joseph didn't waste time putting his plan into action. There were 7 years of abundance ahead, but famine would follow, and every moment of preparation counted. Genesis 41:46-49 tells us how Joseph began his work. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from Pharaoh's presence and traveled throughout Egypt. During the 7 years of abundance, the land produced plentifully. Joseph collected all the food produced in those 7 years of abundance in Egypt and stored it in the cities. In each city, he put the food grown in the fields surrounding it. Joseph stored up huge quantities of grain, like the sand of the sea. It was so much that he stopped keeping records because it was beyond measure. At 30 years old, Joseph was finally seeing the fulfillment of the dreams from his youth. He had gone from prison to palace, and now he traveled throughout Egypt, organizing the most ambitious storage system the ancient world had ever seen. The passage shows us that Joseph wasn't just sitting on a throne giving orders. He traveled throughout Egypt, personally overseeing the implementation of his plan. In each city, he set up granaries to store the local harvests. It was a smart logistical strategy. Grain didn't have to be transported far, and each region would have its own reserves when the famine came. The abundance of those 7 years was so great that Joseph eventually stopped measuring how much was being stored. It was like the sand of the sea, a biblical expression for something immeasurable. The plan was working beyond expectations. During this time of prosperity, Joseph's personal life also flourished. Genesis 41:50-52 tells us, "Before the years of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph by Asenath, daughter of Potiphera, priest of On. Joseph named his firstborn Manasseh and said, 'It is because God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household.' The second son he named Ephraim and said, 'It is because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering.'" The names Joseph gave his sons reveal a lot about his emotional and spiritual state at this point in his life. Manasseh means he who makes forget. Joseph acknowledged that God had helped him overcome the trauma of being sold by his brothers and separated from his father. It's not that Joseph had forgotten his family, this becomes clear later in the story, but the pain of those memories had been eased by the new purpose God had given him. Ephraim means twice fruitful. This name celebrated the fact that God had turned Joseph's suffering into prosperity. After years of slavery and imprisonment, Joseph now held a position of honor, had a family, and lived with meaningful purpose. What his brothers had meant for harm, God had turned into good. Eventually, the 7 years of abundance ended, just as Joseph had predicted, and famine began to spread across the land. Genesis 41:53-54 describes, "The 7 years of abundance in Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began, just as Joseph had said. There was famine in all the other lands, but in the whole land of Egypt there was food." The famine did not just affect Egypt, it reached surrounding regions as well. It was a regional crisis, impacting multiple nations and peoples. However, thanks to Joseph's plan, Egypt was more prepared than any other nation. The people reacted quickly. Genesis 41:55-56 continues, "When all Egypt began to feel the famine, the people cried to Pharaoh for food. Then Pharaoh told all the Egyptians, 'Go to Joseph and do what he tells you.' When the famine had spread over the whole country, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe throughout Egypt. The system worked exactly as intended. When the people began to suffer from hunger, Pharaoh didn't need to worry. He simply referred them to Joseph, who had everything under control. Joseph opened the storehouses that had been filled during the years of plenty and began distributing grain in an organized way. It's interesting to note that the text says Joseph sold the grain to the Egyptians. This wasn't a free handout, but a controlled sale. That likely helped prevent panic, hoarding, or waste. It also ensured that the system could be sustained through the 7 long years of famine. The crisis was so severe that it reached beyond Egypt's borders. Genesis 41:57 concludes, "And all the world came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph because the famine was severe everywhere." This final verse sets the stage for the next major moment in Joseph's story, the reunion with his brothers. The famine that spread across all the world eventually reached Canaan, where Jacob and the rest of Joseph's family were living. The crisis that could have destroyed Egypt not only saved the nation, it also became the means by which Joseph's family would be preserved and reunited. Joseph's God-inspired plan had worked perfectly. From a forgotten prisoner, he had become the savior of an entire nation, and unknowingly, the savior of his own family as well. His journey from the pit to the palace was nearly complete, but God still had more surprises in store for this faithful servant. The famine Joseph had foretold did not stop at Egypt's borders. It spread across neighboring lands, including Canaan, where Jacob and the rest of Joseph's family lived. As food supplies dwindled, Jacob heard that there was grain available in Egypt. In Genesis 42, 1-2, we see how the news reached them. When Jacob learned that there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why do you just keep looking at each other?" He continued, "I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us, so that we may live and not die." Jacob sent 10 of his sons to Egypt to buy food, but he kept Benjamin, the youngest, at home. Genesis 42:4 explains, "But Jacob did not send Benjamin, Joseph's brother, with the others, because he was afraid that harm might come to him." Benjamin was Rachel's only other son besides Joseph, and after losing Joseph, Jacob was extremely protective of Benjamin. When the brothers arrived in Egypt, they were directed to Joseph, just like everyone else who came to buy grain. Genesis 42:6-7 describes the moment. Now Joseph was the governor of the land, the person who sold grain to all its people. So when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. As soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he pretended to be a stranger and spoke harshly to them. This is a powerful moment in the narrative. The dreams Joseph had as a young man, the ones that had so angered his brothers, were now coming true, literally. They were bowing before him just like the sheaves in his first dream. Yet Joseph chose not to reveal himself right away. Instead, he accused them of being spies. Genesis 42:9 says, "Then he remembered his dreams about them and said to them, 'You are spies. You have come to see where our land is unprotected.'" The brothers strongly denied this, explaining that they were all sons of one man living in Canaan. Joseph persisted with the accusation and had them thrown into prison for 3 days. Then he proposed a test. One of them would remain behind as a guarantee while the others returned to Canaan to bring back Benjamin, the younger brother they had mentioned. This, he said, would prove their honesty and show that they were not spies. The brothers spoke among themselves about the difficult situation, not realizing that Joseph understood everything they said. They spoke in Hebrew, assuming he needed an interpreter. Genesis 42:21-22 records their conversation. They said to one another, "Surely we are being punished because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life, but we would not listen. That's why this distress has come upon us." Reuben replied, "Didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy? But you wouldn't listen. Now we must give an accounting for his blood." Hearing this, Joseph was deeply moved. Genesis 42:24 says, "He turned away from them and began to weep." Even after all those years, the pain of betrayal was still alive. And now, seeing the genuine remorse of his brothers, Joseph was overwhelmed with emotion. Joseph chose Simeon as a hostage and ordered that the other brothers' bags be filled with grain. Secretly, he also instructed that the money each of them had brought be returned to their sacks, along with their provisions. The brothers departed, leaving Simeon imprisoned in Egypt. When the 9 brothers returned home, they told Jacob everything that had happened, and to their surprise, discovered the money in their sacks. Genesis 42:35 says, "As they were emptying their sacks, there in each man's sack was his pouch of silver. When they and their father saw the money pouches, they were frightened. Jacob was distraught at the thought of sending Benjamin to Egypt. In Genesis 42:36, he laments, 'You have deprived me of my children. Joseph is no more and Simeon is no more, and now you want to take Benjamin. Everything is against me.'" Reuben tried to reassure his father, offering his own sons as a guarantee for Benjamin's safety. But Jacob stood firm. "My son will not go down there with you. His brother is dead, and he is the only one left. If harm comes to him on the journey you are taking, you will bring my gray head down to the grave in sorrow." However, the famine persisted, and eventually their food ran out. Jacob asked his sons to return to Egypt to buy more supplies, but Judah reminded him they couldn't go without Benjamin. Genesis 43, 3-5 records Judah's words. But Judah said to him, "The man warned us solemnly, 'You will not see my face again unless your brother is with you. If you will send our brother along with us, we will go down and buy food for you. But if you will not send him, we will not go down, because the man said to us, "You will not see my face again unless your brother is with you."' Finally, Judah offered himself as a guarantee for Benjamin's safety, promising Jacob, "I myself will be responsible for him. You can hold me personally accountable. If I do not bring him back to you and set him here before you, I will bear the blame before you all my life." Moved by this promise, Jacob agreed at last. He instructed his sons to take gifts for the Egyptian governor: balm, honey, spices, myrrh, pistachios, and almonds, as well as double the money to return what had previously been found in their sacks. Heavy-hearted but resolute, the brothers set out for Egypt, this time taking Benjamin with them. When Joseph saw Benjamin with his brothers, he was deeply touched. He ordered his steward to bring them to his house for a meal. The brothers were alarmed, thinking they were being taken in to be punished for the silver found in their sacks. At Joseph's house, they explained everything to the steward, who reassured them, "Peace to you. Do not be afraid. Your God, the God of your father, has given you treasure in your sacks. I received your silver." Then he brought Simeon out to them. When Joseph came in for the meal, they presented their gifts and bowed down before him. He asked how their father was doing and then laid eyes on Benjamin. Genesis 43, 29, 30 captures this emotional moment. As he looked about and saw his brother, Benjamin, his own mother's son, he asked, "Is this your youngest brother, the one you told me about?" And he said, "God be gracious to you, my son." Deeply moved at the sight of his brother, Joseph hurried out and looked for a place to weep. He went into his private room and wept there. During the banquet, Joseph seated his brothers in order of birth, from the oldest to the youngest, which astonished them. How could this Egyptian official possibly know their ages? Then he gave Benjamin 5 times as much food as the others, subtly testing whether any jealousy remained among them. The next morning, Joseph had their bags filled with grain again, and once more their silver was returned to their sacks. But this time, he added something more. His own silver cup was placed in Benjamin's sack. Soon after they left, Joseph sent his steward after them to accuse them of theft. Confident of their innocence, the brothers said, "If any of your servants is found to have it, he will die, and the rest of us will become my lord's slaves." When the cup was discovered in Benjamin's sack, they tore their clothes in anguish. Back at Joseph's house, Judah stepped forward and made a heartfelt appeal, offering himself as a slave in Benjamin's place. In Genesis 44, 18-34, Judah explains the entire situation, speaking of Jacob's love for Benjamin and how the loss of this son would surely bring the old man to his grave. Judah's final words reveal a profound change in his character. "Now then, please let your servant remain here as my lord's slave in place of the boy, and let the boy return with his brothers. How can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? No, do not let me see the misery that would come on my father." This was a stunning contrast to the Judah who years earlier had suggested selling Joseph as a slave. Now he was willing to become a slave himself to save Benjamin. This act of sacrifice and brotherly love touched Joseph deeply. Joseph could no longer contain his emotions. Genesis 45, 1-2 tells us, "Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, 'Have everyone leave my presence.' So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers, and he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. With tears in his eyes, Joseph finally revealed his identity. 'I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?' His brothers were so stunned that they couldn't respond. Then Joseph said, "Come closer to me." When they came nearer, he continued, "I am Joseph, your brother, the one you sold into Egypt. But now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you." This is one of the most powerful declarations in the Bible. Joseph harbored no resentment for the years he spent in slavery and unjust imprisonment. Instead, he saw God's hand in all that had happened. Genesis 45:7-8 records his explanation, "God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then, it was not you who sent me here, but God." Joseph explained that 5 more years of famine were still to come, and instructed his brothers to bring their father and all their families to Egypt, where he would provide for them. He embraced Benjamin and wept, then embraced all his brothers, and finally they talked together. Overwhelmed with emotion, Pharaoh heard about the arrival of Joseph's brothers and was pleased. He offered them the best land in Egypt and sent carts to help transport their families and belongings. When the brothers returned to Canaan and told Jacob that Joseph was alive and was governor of all Egypt, the old patriarch didn't believe them at first. Genesis 45:26-27 says, "They told him, 'Joseph is still alive. In fact, he is ruler of all Egypt.' Jacob was stunned. He did not believe them. But when they told him everything Joseph had said to them, and when he saw the carts Joseph had sent to carry him back, the spirit of their father Jacob revived. Jacob, also called Israel, then decided to go to Egypt to see his beloved son before he died. On the way at Beersheba, God spoke to him in a night vision, "I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you into a great nation there. I will go down to Egypt with you, and I will surely bring you back again. And Joseph's own hand will close your eyes." So at 130 years old, Jacob traveled to Egypt with his entire family, 70 people in total. Joseph prepared his chariot and went to Goshen to meet his father. Genesis 46:29-30 describes their emotional reunion. Joseph had his chariot made ready and went to Goshen to meet his father Israel. As soon as Joseph appeared before him, he threw his arms around his father and wept for a long time. Israel said to Joseph, "Now I am ready to die, since I have seen for myself that you are still alive." Joseph introduced 5 of his brothers to Pharaoh, who confirmed that they could settle in Goshen, the best region in Egypt, and even offered jobs to those skilled with livestock. Joseph also introduced his father to Pharaoh, and Jacob blessed the Egyptian ruler. As the famine persisted, Joseph wisely managed Egypt's resources. First, people spent all their money to buy grain. When their money ran out, Joseph accepted livestock in exchange for food. Finally, when they had nothing left, they sold their land and even themselves as servants to Pharaoh. Through these measures, Joseph acquired nearly all the land in Egypt for Pharaoh, except the land belonging to the priests. He then established a system where people could farm Pharaoh's land, giving 1/5 of the harvest as tax and keeping the other 4/5 for themselves. This administrative system endured for generations. Jacob's family prospered in Goshen. Genesis 47:27 tells us, "Now the Israelites settled in Egypt in the region of Goshen. They acquired property there and were fruitful and increased greatly in number. After 17 years in Egypt, Jacob sensed that his end was near. He called for Joseph and asked him not to bury him in Egypt, but to take his body back to the land of his ancestors. Joseph promised to do so. Later, when he heard that his father was ill, Joseph brought his 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, so that Jacob could bless them. In a touching moment, Jacob crossed his arms, placing his right hand on Ephraim, the younger, and his left on Manasseh, the firstborn. Joseph tried to correct his father, thinking the old man had confused the boys due to his poor eyesight, but Jacob replied, "I know, my son. I know. He too will become a people, and he too will be great. Nevertheless, his younger brother will be greater than he, and his descendants will become a multitude of nations." Jacob then formally adopted both grandsons as his own sons, giving Joseph a double portion of the family inheritance. Next, Jacob called all his sons and gave each a prophetic blessing. To Judah, he foretold that the scepter would not depart from his tribe until the one to whom it belongs comes. To Joseph, he spoke of abundant blessings from heaven and earth. Finally, after blessing all his sons, Jacob died at the age of 147. Joseph threw himself on his father's face, wept over him, and kissed him. He ordered the physicians to embalm Jacob's body, a process that took 40 days, and the Egyptians mourned him for 70 days. With Pharaoh's permission, Joseph took his father's body to be buried in the cave of Machpelah in Canaan, where Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Rebekah, and Leah were also buried. A large Egyptian entourage accompanied the family to the funeral, showing the respect they held for Joseph. After Jacob's funeral, Joseph's brothers began to fear that without their father's presence, Joseph might finally take revenge for the wrongs they had done. They sent Joseph a message claiming that Jacob had asked him before dying to forgive his brother's crime. Genesis 50:17 tells us Joseph's reaction. When their message came to him, Joseph wept. His brothers then came in person, bowed before him, and said, "We are your slaves." Joseph's response in Genesis 50:19-21 reveals the depth of his character and faith. "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. Joseph lived to be 110 years old, and he saw the third generation of Ephraim's children. Before his death, he said to his brothers, "I am about to die, but God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land to the land he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." Joseph made the Israelites swear that when God came to their aid, they would carry his bones out of Egypt. After his death, he was embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt. It would be over 400 years before Moses, during the Exodus, carried Joseph's bones back to the Promised Land, fulfilling this extraordinary man's final request. In Joshua 24:32, we see the completion of that promise. And Joseph's bones, which the Israelites had brought up from Egypt, were buried at Shechem, in the tract of land that Jacob bought for 100 pieces of silver from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem. This became the inheritance of Joseph's descendants. Joseph's life was an extraordinary journey, filled with extreme highs and lows, from being the favored son to a slave sold by his own brothers, from prisoner to governor. His story is a powerful testimony of God's sovereignty, even in the darkest of circumstances. Through every trial, Joseph held on to his integrity and faith. The young man who once had great dreams lived to see them come true in ways he never could have imagined. The boy with the colorful robe would one day wear the fine linen of an Egyptian governor. Even more striking was his ability to forgive those who had wronged him, recognizing God's hand even in the most painful moments of his life. When he told his brothers, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good," Joseph was expressing a deep spiritual truth that goes far beyond his own story. Through Joseph's life, God preserved the family of Israel during a severe famine, allowing them to grow and multiply in Egypt. What began as a family tragedy ended in the salvation of many, setting the stage for the birth of a nation. My friend, if you've stayed with me this far, Joseph's story reminds us that even in the hardest moments of our lives, God has a bigger plan. Joseph went from the pit to the prison, and from the prison to the palace. He was betrayed, sold, falsely accused, and forgotten. but he never lost his faith or integrity, and when he finally revealed his identity to his brothers, he said something that should echo in our hearts. "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." May we hold on to that same confidence in God when we face our own challenges. If this story touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Click the like button to help me reach more people with these Bible stories. Leave a comment sharing which part spoke to you the most, or which other stories you'd like to see featured on this channel. And if you're not subscribed yet, now's the perfect time. Click the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any of the upcoming Bible story videos. Share this video with a friend or loved one who might need to be reminded of God's faithfulness in difficult times. Sometimes, a simple Bible story can bring hope to someone walking through a valley. Thanks for joining me on Joseph's incredible journey. May God bless your week, and I'll see you in the next video.